you're no less of a man for having been through them or dealing with them, right? That would have allowed me to speak up faster.
About Brian, an author, blogger, and software developer from Boston. He graduated from Boston College in 2012 with a degree in management and computer science. After college, Brian put his computer science background to use as both a consultant and a writer. His book series, Get Out of Your Head, draws parallels between computer systems and the human mind and gives readers practical strategies for overcoming anxiety and depression. Much of Brian's writing focuses on health, wellness, and personal development. He is passionate about using his skills to positively influence the lives of others.
Um, First of all, tell me, how did you've got a computer science background. How did you move from computer science to focusing on health and wellness?
Yeah. So the the longer answer is that it's a little complicated in the sense that I still have a full-time job as a software developer, and that helps me pay the bills and keep the lights on. But the answer of and maybe I meant to say that's the shorter answer. The longer answer is um the fact that so if I roll the tape back 15 years or so, ready? Okay, so I'm 34 now. Let's say, yeah, 16-ish years. When I was 17, 18 years old, kind of unknowingly, I was dealing with some mental health issues, right? I was dealing with a lot of anxiety, but I didn't know what that really was. I didn't have a term for it. I don't come from a background or a household of doctors. And so we didn't have a vocabulary or a lexicon or anything like that. As those issues or challenges started to grow and become more difficult, I think just as a layperson, like when you struggle with these things, you eventually hit some kind of wall or some breaking point where you're like, this is impeding me enough in my life in different areas where, like, if I don't get a grip on this thing, I'm not, I'm going to be held back. I'm not going to achieve the things that I want to achieve in my life. Or at the very least, I'm just going to feel terrible all the time. Right. So I kind of took it upon myself. And, I always say on podcasts, I'm like, I don't, I don't necessarily recommend that everybody go about it the way that I did of, white knuckling it, doing a ton of research, really trying to figure it out on their own. Like now that it's 2024 and there's a ton of resources out there. I will say, like, and I know I'm kind of jumping all around and whatnot, but like, as an example, right? Like therapy is an amazing resource. Go use it if you have access to it and you can afford it. The difficulty, though, is as much as we talk about therapy these days, it's really hard to find a therapist. It's really expensive and you might not always have one local to you. You might have to go travel or you might have to do it online where, let's be honest, like interacting with somebody online versus in the flesh in person is not quite the same thing. So for me, right, I was like, I tried out a lot of different things. I read a ton of books. I read journal articles. I did go to some therapy. I went to some personal development seminars. I talked with friends and family members, and I was just trying to figure out, okay, what am I dealing with? What might help me deal with it better? And then once I did that for long enough, I was like, okay, I sort of synthesized down a lot of the information that I collected and figured out what was most helpful for me. So going back to the part of how did I become, interested or involved in the wellness space despite being a software person, it was basically as I was going through my life and my career as a software developer, I kept rubbing up or running into problems on the mental health front, the anxiety, the depression, some OCD stuff, right? And so it was basically just like I said to myself, in the course of me living my life, if I want to live a better life, if I want to be happier, I have to confront this stuff. And then as I started to do that and found some of those tactics that I talked about or that information that I talked about that helped me deal with this stuff, I eventually kind of came back or looked around and was like, I now have a lot of information at my disposal that I think would be helpful for other people. So the wellness part or me being involved in the wellness space was basically me saying, because I have so much information and such a passion for this space, I want to give that information out to other people in the form of podcasting, blogs, books, you name it. So that's the story there.
Okay. Our listeners are health coaches and doctors and nurses and mental health specialists. So when we go through these questions, maybe we could look at ways to make it easier for useful information for them.
Okay.
Not easier for, but I turned it around to being useful information for the people who are listening.
Sure.
And I think that it's good for everybody to hear how difficult it was for you to get help, because there's definitely a problem with availability. And I'm wondering too, you talked about online help. Is there anything that you can see that would have made that easier for you?
Well, I think one part is just like the technology itself, right? So if I go back to 2007 when I was dealing with anxiety, like video chat was not a thing, or at the very least, it was such poor quality that no companies tried to form themselves online and say, we're going to base our product around video conversations, right? So I think the space, the technology space in the world that we're in now allows and facilitates for conversations like that, just like the one we're having right now. Whereas
Mhm.
go back into 2007 and you and I wouldn't be having this conversation either. So, when I look at different tools and all that, my basic philosophy is like, I don't denigrate any one specific methodology or form of treatment or anything like that. My lens on dealing with anxiety and depression and these different conditions is, each person to a degree has to figure out what works best for them and then sort of assemble those different ideas and tactics together to create their own individual mental health toolkit. I will do my best, right, through my writing and podcasting to try to curate some of those ideas down and say, like, hey, here's a popular idea that gets thrown around in that mental health or personal development world a lot that just doesn't really work for a lot of people. And here's why, right? So I can do that curation. But there is a level of kind of trying on different tactics and strategies that every listener, every reader is going to have to do a little bit of, right? Because we're all a little bit different and not every single tactic or idea resonates with all of us.
What would have helped you when you first um, noticed that there was something that needed to be addressed?
Yeah, I think what would have helped, right, is so again, going back to sort of the ethos of 2007 and just where the world was, what the conversation was like in our peer circles and on the internet and all that. And, in 2007, the world was quite different, right? And so, not that you couldn't find some of it back then, but in 2007, I think there was a lot more machismo, push it down, dealing with anxiety, having depression. There was a notion that dealing with those things was not acceptable for a dude, for a man, right? And I think what would have been really great in that time frame, like obviously this is a very big ask and it's impossible because it's in the past, but in 2007, if it let's just say if at that time it was like everybody was like, hey, dealing with mental health problems is okay, and you're no less of a man for having been through them or dealing with them, right? That would have allowed me to speak up faster. And then instead of maybe me feeling as though I needed to go do all my own research sort of in secrecy, I would have gotten access to those resources faster, whether that's, a doctor right away, a psychiatrist right away, more conversations with other people sooner that helped me draw more inferences, right? And so I think one of the really positive developments in the mental health space in the last 2 decades is the fact that now that we have social media, now that we have the internet, not that there aren't pros and cons to those things, but one of the pros is that a lot of people are out there online spreading the message that it is okay to deal with these things. In fact, it's kind of quite normal, right? Where you look at the statistics and you see that 1 in 5 Americans deals with a relatively difficult mental health disorder every single year, and from that lens, you're like, if I was 17 and I'd heard that, I'd be like, okay, I'm not the only one in the world. I'm not quote unquote crazy, right? And then that would make me feel a little bit more safe, so to speak, to be able to go talk to other people and get access to those resources faster.
I think kids still think there's something wrong with them. They're embarrassed to, and you know, I think the pandemic made everything blow up so that, they got um more stringent in reaching out and saying that there are problems and they're getting bigger and you need to address the problems, but it's still, you see the kids and they're suffering from depression, and that's a lot of time that's just a part of growing up too. um but they think there's something wrong with them and they don't want to tell anybody.
Yeah, and there's two sides to every argument. So despite what I just said, right, you're totally right where there is still a problem out there. And some of it is human nature, some of it is the nature of being a kid, right? Where I
Mhm.
mean, we all want to fit in and be loved and be respected and whatnot. And when you're a kid, like you just don't have the evidence of living a life to know that certain people deal with X, other people deal with Y, right? And being able to have that rationality in your head to say, like, this is okay. This is normal, right? When you're a kid, you don't have a lot of evidence at your disposal, life evidence to be like, okay, I know what this is. I know that it's okay. I know that it's normal. You're just thinking to yourself, how do I survive? How do I not get bullied on a daily basis? And because I don't have that other evidence, as a kid, you're not sitting there being like, yeah, this is okay, yada, yada. All you're thinking about is like, if I admit that I'm dealing with X, if I admit that I'm dealing with Y, like it's going to be bad. And until you have counter evidence to, poke holes in that belief, so to speak, you are more likely to just keep it to yourself. And I think probably what happens for a lot of kids is that you just reach a breaking point where you're like, you come home one day, maybe you got bullied at school, maybe you were just anxious. It just came out, right? And people made fun of you for it or whatever. And you come home to one of your parents or a parent and you just cry. And the parent is just like, what happened? And then that becomes the starting point of the conversation to be like, let's figure out what this is, or at the very least, I can support you through this and I can give you some of the wisdom that I have. I can impart that on you to be like, hey, not trying to scare you, but a lot of people deal with these things and it's okay, right? So I think that is a really important part to highlight, like you did earlier. So
So, okay, so let's go back to this. What is anxiety and what are the primary ways that it shows up?
yeah, so I mean, I'm not,
Phases.
I don't pretend to be like a doctor or somebody who wrote the dictionary, but I just like to provide simple terms, right? Boil things down for people in sort of a layperson's fashion. So I always say that anxiety is future-oriented fear. So you can think of fear as like in the middle of a really scary scenario, like if there is a bear in front of you and you are very worried that that bear is about to eat you, that's fear, right? Anxiety is more worrying about that scenario happening a couple weeks from now. So being afraid that in a month you're going to encounter a bear and something bad is going to happen there. So the reason I kind of gave the preamble of I'm not a doctor, I'm not somebody who writes the dictionary is more in line with the second part of the question, which is basically what are primary ways by which anxiety arises. There are more than two ways, but I like to say, just again to boil things down for folks and make it approachable, I like to say that there's two most common ways. So there's the body and there's the mind, right? So what do I mean by that? Let's start with the mind. Um, if you wanted to, which nobody wants to, but sometimes we do, right? You could just start thinking about scary things. Going back to the bear example, you could just sit on your couch and you could ruminate and worry about running into a bear a month from now. And when you do that, you're probably going to scare yourself, right? And as you scare yourself, that is the anxiety awakening itself. From there, because you have activated the anxiety and then also the fight or flight nervous system in the body, you're going to get some physical symptoms. So maybe you might start sweating, like you might, feel the beads of sweat on your forehead or on your palms. Your heart might start racing. You might have a little bit of tunnel vision. You might have an upset stomach, whatever it is. So that's kind of the body piece, is feeling those physical symptoms. And then from there, what can happen or often does happen is this process becomes a bit of a vicious cycle where we think into fear. The fear creates physical symptoms. We react to the physical symptoms with our thoughts and more fear. That fear generates stronger physical symptoms, and so on and so forth. The other way that this sort of vicious cycle can come about is just through the body itself, right? So let's say we go to a birthday party or a social outing for a friend or a group of uh, classmates or whatever, and we get there, and all of a sudden we're like, oh geez, I'm really nervous right now. My heart is racing. And if you broke that down, it would probably be like, well, I'm nervous because I'm around all these people. I want to make a good impression, so on and so forth. But the body, right, is sort of the entry point there where you feel your heart racing, and that triggers you to start thinking fearfully. And then you say, why is my heart racing? Oh, should that be happening or should it not be? You generate fear in your mind. And then again, we're back in that same vicious cycle where the fear in the mind feeds the physical symptoms feed the mind again, and so on and so forth. And so, one of the reasons this is a shameless plug, but one of the reasons that my brand is called Get Out of Your Head is because we often find ourselves getting into this vicious cycle again and again. And one of the best ways out of it is to break the cycle through getting out of your mind and stopping the thinking part, right? Because we don't have control over whether, like direct control over whether or not our hearts race. We have indirect control, which again, it's because this cycle feeds upon itself. So if we say, hey, look, I know right now I'm in this vicious cycle, and what I need to do is I need to neutralize the thinking and the fear associated with it. Then once you do that, you kind of send a signal back to your body to say, look, this is okay. It might be scary, it might be frightening, but it's okay. And then that signal tells the body to calm down its symptoms, right? And then the vicious cycle becomes something one of at the very least it kind of slows down. If not, I don't want to say it becomes a positive or upward cycle because we're just trying to get back to calm, but at the very least we cut off that vicious cycle in its tracks. So that's usually the lens through which I tell folks about anxiety, what it is and how it arises.
I think about that in two ways. One way is, you might be sitting there thinking about the bear and you get anxiety. And really, that's not a terrible thing, because if you're going someplace where there's going to be a bear, maybe you can think in advance what you could do to protect yourself. And, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one thing that I tell folks about, and it is a key part of my first book is saying like all of these protective mechanisms in the body are meant to help facilitate our survival, right? So as you just alluded to, is like, yeah, if you had no anxiety ever, you would probably jump headfirst into a pit of snakes, and that would be horrible, right?
Oh, and
Um,
I've known kids like that too. No fear.
exactly. So what we're trying to do, like, so when I give that whole speech that I just gave, the assumption that I'm making is that we are so far down the spectrum of, essentially our bodies being so vigilant and so protective that it is hindering us, right? And so the goal with anxiety is not to have zero anxiety ever or zero fear or anything like that, because again, it is a protective measure. However, we want to be in the middle, so to speak, where we have a little bit of it so that it holds us back from doing really incredibly dangerous things. But we don't want so much of it that we can't live the lives that we want to lead or live normal lives, right? So much of this is under that assumption of like, look, you're probably on this. I use the wrong term, as in like on the spectrum of. I'm not saying autism, right? But on the gradient of you are down on the right hand side of having too much anxiety. We want to get you back to the middle. If somebody's already in the middle, they probably don't have the same emotions that drive them to then find my work or listen to this podcast, if that makes sense.
What about the person who, and I have known people who have done this, they go to speak and they have no fear going in there to speak, but all of a sudden they have a physical reaction to it. Have you ever heard of that, where you skip over the mind part of it and go straight into the body part?
So would that be like the person that doesn't actually feel fear, but then they get on stage and faint?
Something like that. Either that or
Something like
get up
that.
on stage and they can't talk.
It's interesting because not that I haven't heard of that before, but I'm trying to break it down or think about it for the first time in real time. And,
Mhm.
the the reason why I think I give the definition of anxiety being that future oriented fear is right. When we deal with anxiety, we know that so much, if not all of it, is that just angst and feelings of being afraid and not knowing and doubting in advance, right? And
Mhm.
without those feelings, this might be semantics, but I would say that it's not anxiety. I would almost say that if you don't have any of those feelings and then you get on stage and faint, that almost feels like more like, you know, your your sympathetic nervous system, which is also known as your fight or flight nervous system, like kicked in the middle of it once you realized that it was scarier than you expected it to be or you got overwhelmed. I don't know exactly for sure how to break that one down. But clearly there was some physical reaction in the body that caused, I guess we could say, right? If you faint, that is, if it's not an aberration, if it's like not, if that's not meant to happen, and then if we're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective or some sort of protective mechanism, then somehow the body picked up a signal to say, I have just found myself in an unsafe situation, and I find that it would be, and this might be, again, this might not actually make sense in practice, but the body might be saying, I think it's safer to actually shut off here than to go through with this, if that makes sense.
Okay, let's go on to depression. What is it and what are the main ways it comes to fruition?
Yeah. So again, like just like the answer with anxiety, like want to obviously be uh want to just say that there are nuances here, right? So I'm not going to be able to cover every single definition and all that, but how I think about depression, how I talk about it in my writings is depression is a pervasive state of hopelessness and helplessness, right? So if you talk to somebody and they're like, I'm depressed, and you just ask a couple questions, obviously it's a sensitive subject and you don't want to just, willy nilly push every single button. But if you just probe a little bit and you're like, what's going on? What's got you down? um, you would likely hear in some, either indirect or direct fashion from them saying like, one, they don't like where they are in life or in some specific position, and two, they don't feel as though they have power to change it, right? So the hopeless piece is like, yeah, I don't like where I am. I don't know where else to go. The helpless piece is, even if I knew where to go, I don't feel confident that I could get there, right? So it's basically learned helplessness, if you will. That's a term that comes up from like Martin Seligman and some of his studies in psychology. And so, basically, when I say pervasive, right? It's essentially that mindset mapped onto either one large area of your life or your entire life, and that's why it feels as though it gets you so down. Is you go to think about going to work, going to school, trying to set some new goal for yourself or meet some new goal, and everything just looks black and gray. And you're like, not going to happen, not going to happen, not going to happen. So you feel literally pressed down, as if you're never going to make progress. So I guess in some ways I've already touched upon how it comes to fruition, but if we dive into it more, right, there are many ways that it can come to fruition, and there are also many different types of depression, right? So what I may say, like, I will give one definition or one specific example of how it comes to fruition, but I again with the nuances, right? I would say like you look at something like postpartum depression. That is a very, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know the exact terms, but it's like that's a very like it's a neurochemical thing in the body. It's a hormonal thing in the body, right? You just gave birth to this baby. There's all sorts of hormones flooding your body, and for some reason, like I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend to know, but for some reason, after you give birth, right, there's this feeling of separation and loss, and it's spurred by the chemical changes in your body, right? So the definition that I will give in a second, or the example of how it comes to fruition, again, is not going to cover every single case, especially the one that I just gave. However, let's talk about it anyway. So, how does depression come to fruition in some cases, if not many cases? So, one lens that I put on here to talk about it in my second book, which is focused on depression, there's this concept called the biopsychosocial model, which was put forth by George Engel and John Romano out of the University of Rochester in, I want to say, the 1970s, but it might have been the 60s. I can't remember. Anyway, what they say is like, you can look at different diseases through this framework. So the biopsychosocial model, right, is a portmanteau of three different words. So bio is biological, psycho is psychological, and social, that is actually just its own word. Um, what they are saying is basically you can look at some diseases, and let's say depression is one of them, through the lens of the biopsychosocial model to infer the notion that diseases have many different factors that play into them, and those factors can feed off of one another, right? So let's take this further and more in, let's make this more concrete, right? So biological, right? If we're looking at depression, we may say, how do you use your body? What foods do you eat? What neurotransmitter activity is going on in your brain, right? What genetics were you born with? Like, does depression run in your family? Psychological is what do you think? What do you believe? What are you telling yourself on a daily basis? Social is kind of more of just the remainder. It's like a catch-all bucket. So it's like, what are your relationships like? What are your friendships like? Do you like your job? Do you like where you grew up? Do you have fulfilling goals and dreams in your life that you're pursuing, right? And so looking at depression from the biopsychosocial model, we could say that if any of those three, we'll call them buckets, um, are not filled to the top, so to speak, we could potentially encounter depression. At the same time, those buckets kind of influence one another, right? Where it's like, look, if your social bucket is completely empty, that may cast a shadow over the rest of your life where, then all of a sudden you feel different in your body, right? You have a lack of energy. You don't feel like you can get out of bed every single day. There's something pulling you down. And then at the same time, right, with that shadow being cast, you're telling yourself negative things all the time. You're believing that maybe life is never going to get better or whatever it may be. And so the reason I like this example is because it's broad enough that you can apply it to a lot of different scenarios, right? So if somebody says like, hey, I lost my job, my relationship is not going well, and physically I'm not where I'm at in term where I want to be in terms of fitness, you can say, okay, it kind of seems like your biological bucket is half full, and your social bucket is like almost empty. According to the biopsychosocial model, that could, kind of lay the groundwork for depression to emerge. And you could go on through down the chain and, give an example of one where the psychological bucket is empty and so on and so forth. Why again, I like it because it's broad, but I also like it because it gives you that a little bit of concreteness where it helps you build something of an action plan, right? And if depression is really a condition of being helpless and being hopeless, being able to create a plan gives you some agency. And then when you have agency, that is actually kind of the opposite of the definition of depression. And so that gives you a path forward to get out of the depression. I'm never saying that depression is easy to get out of. I'm never saying you can just turn it off or anything like that. But what we're looking for, right, is tools that we can apply because when we're in that really dark and hopeless state, we're like floundering and we don't know anything. So looking at the biopsychosocial model gives us some path forward. And I think that's valuable.
Aside from medication, what can we do to lessen our experience of depression?
For sure. So, I guess to kind of keep going with the answer that I just provided, right, is
Mhm.
it is important whether you do it, with yourself or by yourself or with the help of a doctor or psychiatrist, you know, look at those different buckets and be honest and say, okay, if I'm actually feeling helpless, if I'm actually feeling hopeless, which of these buckets are most affected, right? You may say like, look, my dog passed away and that is just crushing me, and I'm not saying that there's necessarily a an easy resolution for that, right? Like grief is part of the human condition and it's really hard, but that might at least give you again some sort of concreteness to be able to pin down the source of your agony, at the same time, like going back to, I guess, the social bucket, if you're like every day you're kind of wondering like, oh, is there more to life? What's going on? I don't feel right, whatever. When you're looking at these buckets, it just gives you the ability to map things and say, okay, my social bucket is clearly empty. I'm not going out with enough people. I'm not having fun. It's been a while since I really had a deep connection with somebody. And that gives you that path forward, right? So one way of addressing depression, and it's not again, it's not like a turn a switch on kind of thing, but one way of addressing it is doing that critical work to say which of my buckets are depleted or empty, and then figuring out a path forward from there. I think another, to get off of the biopsychosocial model for a moment, there are some other things that help with the alleviation of depression. I know you said medication, and so what else besides medication could we enlist? Right, there is a
I'm
bunch
not
of,
saying that medication is bad either. I'm just
and
saying that, most of us that are listening are not going to be deciding on the medication end of the thing.
absolutely, and that's where I'm at too. So one of the other options that we have, right? So there's a lot of scientific research showing the effectiveness of exercise in helping us alleviate depression, right? So again, with all of these answers, it's hard. I have to give some nuances where the boiling it all the way down, the answer is, hey, if you're able to get on a regimented exercise plan of some degree, then that can help you feel better. If for no other reason than when you exercise, you are moving your body and you are forcing your body into a different state I guess I'll use the term force again, but forcing your body out of to like you're forcing yourself out of your mind and back into your body, right? You're creating a different neurochemistry in your brain. Um, and there's I forget the exact term, but when you're walking or you're running or whatever, you activate both hemispheres of your brain, because it's a lateral movement, or excuse me, like the lateral movement of your legs and arms, like essentially, right, you have kind of the left hemisphere controls the right side and the right to the left, and so on and so forth. So as you're walking, you're activating your entire brain, and you're changing, again, kind of what's going on in that brain. And so if you're able to detach from the thoughts that you've been turning over and turning over, that can be incredibly helpful. And exercise can put you in a different state that allows you to achieve that end, right? The nuance that I wanted to give was basically like, I've had some conversations with folks, and they are totally right in asking this question. They will say, like, well, Brian, like, what about the person who can't even get out of bed? Like depression is so debilitating for them that like they can't bring themselves to do anything. And none of my answers are meant to be like be all end all solutions. What you really have to do is figure out something that is suitable for you and your situation, right? So if that means, hey, today I'm going to figure out a way to walk 5 or 10 minutes around the block, then that is your start, right? And then you go from there. And if you have a bad day where you can't get out of bed and you can't go for that walk, you dust yourself off, you try it again the next day. If you start making some progress, keep that momentum going, and you're like, hey, I went for 10 minutes yesterday, let's do 15 tomorrow. Um, it's again, nothing is set in stone here. It's like, do the best you can, lean into the activities that help you feel good, and just see where they take you. I can't promise, right, that you're going to be able to, I don't know, go to a CrossFit gym every single day. And I'm not saying that you need to. I'm just saying, like, again, lean into those activities that help you feel a little bit better. And again, if nothing else, right, like exercise feels good because it's one of the only places where, like, we can shut off the computer, we can put our phone in our pockets, we could probably put it on airplane mode if we really want to. We can detach from the chaos in the world of technology. We can get back into nature and into our bodies, detach from the thoughts in our heads, and just have a little escape, have a little break. So that's a really important one that I think is accessible for everybody too, right? Because again, I'm not saying you don't need a gym membership per se. You don't need any fancy equipment. Do whatever makes sense for you in your situation, and just see where that takes you.
Well, and this is something that a health coach can help with too. The lifestyle management, they're not, it's outside of the scope of practice to diagnose and treat, but, supporting somebody through exercise. What about nutrition? Is there some facet of nutrition that can help with anxiety and um, depression?
Yeah, there definitely is. I will say, like, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm a little over my skis here, but I'll talk about what I do know, and maybe some personal experiences or whatever.
Mhm.
The first one being that, like, there is a lot of research out there, and it's not mine, but I'm just saying, like, you can go find it if you want, showing that, like, the brain is mostly consists of like fat and water, right? And so we do need some amount of fat to basically like allow our brains to function properly. And we need a lot of water too, right? So on that front, like making sure that you are staying hydrated can be really good for your mental state and the ability to think clearly. And then also on the fat side, right? So I think people would probably be familiar with the notion of like omega-3 fatty acids or omega-3 supplements, fish oil, that kind of thing. There is research out there showing that if, essentially we need omega-3 fatty acids in our diets, or at least in our bodies to help our brains. And also that research shows that it can be effective in the treatment of depression. So I guess, it's like you got to figure out again, well, first, if you want to take a look at the research, if somebody's listening, please do. There's plenty of it out there. The other piece is there are different ways by which you can get omega-3s into your diet. This leads me into probably the larger conversation around nutrition. So like with omega-3s, the simple answer is if you wanted to, you could go to the store and you could research like a solid brand of omega-3 fatty acids or omega-3 fish oils or whatever, right? To just supplement with daily. The reason why, like going back to the larger scope of nutrition, the reason why I'm not saying we always need supplementation, but the reason why a lot of us are deficient in the omega-3s is because we eat a ton of processed foods, right? And the processing messes with the natural balance of the oils. And so what ends up happening is we get a lot of omega-6s through our diets, not a lot of omega-3s because we're not eating as many natural whole foods, right? If we were eating more in line with nature, we'd be getting more omega-3s. Not necessarily as many as we need, but we'd certainly be getting more. And so going into the larger category of nutrition, one, I think there is research out there. I have not done enough of my own digging into it to really have conclusions on this exact podcast, but there is research showing that, the standard American diet, the processed food diet is not good for our mental health. It basically, right, if you don't get the nutrients and the vitamins and all that you need to put into your body, then you're just not going to operate as well and effectively as you should. And what that might mean is your brain doesn't operate that effectively either. And if your brain is not working that well, hey, guess where anxiety and depression come from? They come from the brain, right? And so we
Right.
want to make sure that we're sort of equipping ourselves with all those micronutrients that we need. Again, I will kind of cut my spiel on nutrition short or cut it there-ish because I haven't done a ton of research there. And it's a subject that I want to explore more and then write about more in the future. But the last piece I'll say on nutrition, right, is this is anecdotal, but I think people can relate to it. Is I talk about this in my first book. It's the notion that like when you don't feel well physically, you have to dedicate energy and resources, physical and mental energy and resources to dealing with the symptoms of not feeling good, right? So what that might mean is, you come home, you down a 2 liter of Pepsi, you have a pizza, and it feels great in the moment, and then 2 hours later, you got a bad stomach ache or nausea or whatever, and you're like, oh man, I'm on the couch for a while, I don't feel good, I have to focus on these symptoms and help them go away, right? One of the difficulties with that is there's only so much brain power that we have and only so much attention that we have. And so when we are putting attention on our physical symptoms that arose from how we ate, we are inevitably abandoning the proverbial posts in our minds that are needed to sort of win the thought game, right? To be able to block out negative thoughts or let go of negative thoughts. And so if we are constantly eating bad foods, feeling bad, and then diverting our attention there, it's going to be harder to ward off those negative thoughts that then lead to anxiety and maybe depression or spur our depression. And so my pitch there is just, be mindful. Think about like as you're eating, how does that food make you feel an hour or 2 hours later? And does that align with your mental health or does that hinder it?
Right. Then sleep and stress. And is a person that's depressed able to deal with stress as well as somebody who is not depressed? I mean, we go through meditation and breathing exercises and all of that it would be difficult to start working with somebody that's depressed. Maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe that would be an easy place to start.
Yeah, so there's a few subjects or questions there, right? So sleep and stress, and then also is somebody who's depressed able to deal with stress as easily? I think I to answer the second part first, I would say that like when you're depressed, and I'm not picking on anybody who's depressed. I've been there before. I'm sure I'll be back there. It just stinks, and basically when you're in that state, it just becomes harder to do anything. You don't have the energy, you don't have that drive, that motivation. And so it's like you stack something else up on top of your to-do list, and it's like, I already didn't think I could get through the day. And how am I supposed to get through with this extra thing? So I think it is important to say that, again, I'm not casting judgment, I'm not belittling anyone. I'm just, saying how I'm just keeping it real and saying it how it is, right? It was when you
Mhm.
are depressed, putting more stress on you and your body and your life, it's just like it's not that helpful, because it's really that frame of depression that you need to get through first. And then once you feel better, being able to get through tasks becomes more manageable. On the stress and the sleep front, like, there's a ton of companies and a ton of podcasters and thought leaders talking about these spaces in depth, as of late, right? And I guess just to add my own 2 cents here, and I'll try to do it succinctly, but there's a lot to say, right? Is so on the sleep front, one thing that some research I alluded to in my first book is basically there's a doctor. I think he's at UC Berkeley. I forget, but he's out in California. Matthew Walker. He wrote this book that a lot of people have read at this point called Why We Sleep. And in that book, he says that like if you are sleep deprived, right? So there are different regions of your brain, and so the prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the brain, and that is sort of your executive function, or that's where your executive function lives, your ability to make decisions and think through different options and plan and all that. And then you've got the older parts of your brains, that are kind of live towards the back. And so that's where, for example, you've got the limbic system, and inside the limbic system is the amygdala, or the two amygdalae, I guess is what they would say. And the amygdala is where fear comes from, right? It's the fear center of the brain, or that's what a lot of people will say. And so basically, when you are sleep deprived, right? Well, let me step back for a second and say the amygdala, if you are anxious, your amygdala are probably more active than the average person, right? They are generating more fear on a more frequent basis than the average person. When you then add a lack of sleep to the mix, what basically happens is it becomes harder for your prefrontal cortex to run effectively, for you to take that executive functioning and apply it, right? And so what that really means is like, when you're sleep deprived, the amygdala is like, hey, dude, here's some fear. Um, we just can't as easily exert control over that fear, over the amygdala, over the sections of our brains that generate that fear. So it is definitely important, to get the sleep that we need. 7 to 9 hours is kind of what uh, Matthew Walker and other folks tell us to aim for. Obviously, it's difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of stresses in the world, and you might live in a place where it's loud, or, you get to bed late, or you have to be up early. So obviously, there's a lot of demands that sometimes get in the way of sleep. But in general, it behooves us to make sure that we're getting a decent amount of sleep. So that way, again, our amygdala are not overriding our prefrontal cortices and making us more miserable through anxiety. On the stress front, I could talk about it for hours. There's so many books that's been written about it recently. I just read a great one called Stolen Focus by Johan Hari. And he was basically saying, right, is like the world has just become so stressful these days. And one of the reasons is that through these technologies that have made tasks more simple, right? It's like you want to talk to somebody in Australia, boom, send them a text message and it's out there and it's delivered to them in 2 seconds. You want to find out different news headlines, jump onto Twitter, you learned about them in 5 seconds, right? And so we do have all these amazing tools at our disposal that allow us to do great things. The issue is that because all this stuff has become so easy and so simple, is that we are now flooded with information and notifications and scary news headlines and demands and deadlines and all that. And that makes life challenging, right? Is one of the examples, or one of the concepts I talk about on the anxiety front is like, okay, so where does anxiety come from? We talked about that a little bit earlier in the show, but you look at the nervous system and you say, okay, so you've got the sympathetic nervous system, aka the fight or flight nervous system, which is basically the part of your nervous system that protects you from scary or threatening things, right? It's sort of the acute stress response. And just by virtue of hearing that name, acute stress response, it's like when there is endless stress being thrown your way, guess what happens? That system is activated and activated and activated, which therefore means you are more likely to experience more anxiety and more anxiety and more anxiety. And so it is really important to make sure that that system is not running hot all the time. In other words, that means that we need to make sure that we're not stressing ourselves out all the time and then leading ourselves to more anxiety by virtue of the process that I just ran through. So again, I could talk about all that stuff ad nauseum, but that's like that's my primer on that stuff.
It's clear that anxiety and depression are big problems these days. Are we making too big of a deal out of them or over-diagnosing it now?
It's it's a great question. It's hard to say, right? I'm not going to comment and say that we definitely are, but I will just talk about like some of the research in this space. So there's a psychological term called prevalence inflation, the prevalence inflation hypothesis. And what that basically suggests is that as people talk about mental health more, as there is more mental health awareness, it can lead people to, number one, see their own distress as not just like stress or a little bit of difficulty, but as pure full-blown mental illness. And then number two, as a result of that, they may think and act in ways that actually lead to true mental illness. And so, as you can tell with my delivery, right? I'm a little bit guarded. I'm a little bit. I bring in the nuances because all this stuff is tricky, and therefore, like my answer to this question is the same, in basically saying that if you look at the prevalence inflation hypothesis, there is a risk that the more we talk about this, the more we ask people like, hey, did you experience depression today? So on and so forth. There is a risk that we cause people to focus more on their mental state and in turn make them experience more anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think that the data is bearing out that we are doing that a little bit, right? One thing that I like to sometimes say, and I'm never trying to belittle somebody's experience. If you're dealing with anxiety for seemingly no reason at all, that is so valid, right? Your experience is your experience. At the same time, right, you may talk to like a grandparent or somebody from an older generation. You're like, I have anxiety because of this, I have depression because of that. And like, they just came from a totally different time, right? Where the world was not always asking them what their mental health state was like. And they may say to you, anxiety, I got shipped off to war when I was 18. You don't know what anxiety is, right? And again, I'm not saying that that is accurate. I'm just saying that different people have different views of the world. And it's clear that we now, like collectively, we look at the world a little bit differently. We look at mental health differently. I think, again, right, is all these things are sort of balancing acts where let's go back 20, 30 years ago, we were on I'll call it the left-hand side of the gradient or the spectrum where this stuff was not talked about enough. It didn't get the attention it deserved, and therefore a lot of people suffered for no good reason or not a great reason, right? Today, it does feel as though the scales are tipping in the other direction where we're talking about this stuff a lot. And therefore, like terms like, again, the prevalence inflation hypothesis are starting to bear out the fact that, hey, maybe there's some negative consequences associated with this. So it's sort of that swinging of the pendulum. And I hope that maybe in the future, we will see that always asking people, about their conditions and whatnot. Like, there was an example I read. There's a book that was really popular in the spring, and it's still popular, but it was really making the rounds called Bad Therapy by Abigail Schreier. And she was just giving examples of like, I think her kid went off to kindergarten class and they all had to take a survey, saying like, have you been abused by a family member? Do you experience PTSD? Do you experience depression? And she was like, the kid's 4 years old. Like, this is overdoing it, you know? And so that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to shed light on here is, again, talking about these things, I do think in the general sense is very beneficial. And I want people to get the help that they need. The issue, right, is that we convince some people who would otherwise be okay to focus on their problems and turn them into bigger things than they actually need to be.
They can get over some of it, right?
Possibly.
Or get it out of your head, right? That's the name of your book.
That would be nice.
Okay, so thank you for being here today. We will have the name, you've got a website, getoutofyourhead.com, that we'll put underneath in the show notes, and everybody can get a hold of you if they want to. And is that the name of your book, Get Out of Your Head? Yep.
Yes.
The
I've
book
got two books.
series.
Yeah, they're both Get Out of Your Head. So the second one is volume 2. The first one is on managing anxiety. The second one is on managing depression. If somebody's listening and they go to look for my book, just look for my name. That's Brian Sachetta. There is another book out there called Get Out of Your Head. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, but that one became really popular and has been a source of my own distress. So
Okay, so look up Brian Sachetta. That's Sachetta, right?
that's correct.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for going a little bit overtime.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Kathy.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Have a good week.
You too.